So thank you for inviting me to come and talk to you here today. It's a great honour to be invited to speak as a Paul Bernard speaker, a very prominent social scientist who made great advances in the field of inequalities, and also the Léa-Roback Centre itself, the combination of public health practice and public health research on the theme of health inequalities seems to me to be a unique and special place. So thank you. I'm going to talk to you about geographical inequalities in health, looking at how place influences health, and taking a political epidemiology perspective and arguing about the importance of a political approach to our understanding of health inequalities. So I'm going to talk from a political epidemiology perspective. And political epidemiology has a long history dating back to the 19th century, and people like Friedrich Engels and Rudolf Virchow were talking about the importance of political decisions and political actions in influencing population health. And of course, there's the famous quote from Virchow talking about how medicine is actually of politics operating at a population level. I've done a lot of work in this field with other colleagues as well, who you might recognise, Ted Schrecker, the Canadian. We've written some work together from a political epidemiology perspective. And today I'm going to use this perspective to talk through some examples, 3 examples. I'm going to talk about the US health disadvantage, why the US has worse health than other rich democracies. I'm going to talk about regional inequalities in health with a focus on the north-south divide in England. And I'm going to talk about neighbourhood inequalities, so between rich and poor neighbourhoods of our towns and cities. I'm going to talk you through some of the conventional explanations for these inequalities that have come from the public health and geographical literature. And then I'm going to move on to why I think we need to take a more upstream approach, thinking about the macro political determinants of health inequalities. So to start off with the first example, which is the US health disadvantage. So the US, until the 1950s, used to have an health advantage over other comparator countries, so Western Europe, Canada, Japan, and so forth. It was the tallest, people had the best nutrition. But over the last sort of 60 years, it's gone from being the tallest to arguably the least healthy, the sickest of the high-income countries. This chart just shows an example of where the US is doing badly, and that's in terms of obesity rates. And we can see here in the 1980s, the US is in the middle of the pack, but now we can see that it's much, much higher than even the nearest country, which is the United Kingdom. So the US is doing badly on that measure, but we can also see that it's doing badly on other fundamental measures, including, for example, life expectancy. So this chart just shows how the US has been ranked in terms of life expectancy with other high-income countries. We can see it's never been a top performer, but over various decades it's slipped down the relative rankings and is now at the bottom of these 19 countries, with a 2-year gap from the average and a 4-year gap from the best performers. Of course, this is with the US having the highest GDP of those countries as well. This is just a little bit more detail on the life expectancy, but we can also see here for infant mortality rates that the US is at the bottom these days, with rates almost 3 times as high as those countries that are doing the best. This just gives a little bit more detail in terms of the disadvantage, in terms of other causes of death, specific causes. We can see things particularly around deaths from injury and violence is much higher. Obviously, I've mentioned obesity beforehand, and we can also see it, as you would expect, in terms of the major causes like cardiovascular disease. Perhaps a more fun way to try and think through the US health disadvantage is to compare US cities and states with nearest neighbour here in Canada. And I'm a bit of a sports fan. I missed out, unfortunately, on seeing the Montreal Canadiens play, but this has not put me off, and I will be back in order to see them. And so I've put together a National Health League using your hockey teams as the kind of geographical reference point. So we have the life expectancy for the provinces here attached to their relevant team. And the point, more serious point we want to make here is that we can see here that Canadian teams are doing a lot better. So the life expectancy is a lot better than those for the various US states. So we've got big gaps here. So that's for the Eastern Conference. Probably a bit disappointing for you guys with the placement there. And then we can see over in the Western Conference, again, the Canadian team's doing particularly well, and particularly, of course, Vancouver. So if we were to go through to a Stanley Cup situation, then I'm afraid, from your point of view, Vancouver would win. But more seriously, we can see that there were quite big gaps between the various US states and the Canadian states. So that's a bit of an aside, but there's a serious point within that. So that's the first example that I'm going to talk about, is the US health disadvantage. Why is it that the US is doing so badly compared to other comparator countries? The second example is to look into regional inequalities. So in a sense, we've had a bit of a preview of that with the National Health League, the hockey comparison, because obviously that was comparing the kind of regions, the provinces of Canada and the states of the US. But in England, we have a long-standing divide between the northern areas and the southern areas of England in terms of things like life expectancy. There is a bit of a debate about where the north is, which I won't bore you with here. I'm sure you have similar debates about where your north starts and so on. But for us, it's these three regions, and you can see there that that's where I'm based in Newcastle University. So a little bit more detail. This is the traffic light diagram. This is showing that life expectancy here is worse in the northern areas than in the southern regions, and the gap between the here and the green in the south is around 2 years. So these are above average, around average, and below average. This is for female life expectancy, but for almost any health indicator, the traffic light would look the same. And also it's similar for men. This has been a long-standing divide, something that has a historical basis to it. And we can see here that this is data from 1842, from Edwin Chadwick's report into the health of the labouring classes in Victorian England. And you can see that across each of the different social classes, the life expectancy in the rural southern areas is a lot higher than it is in the urban areas, but particularly in the urban northern areas. So just to take perhaps the most chilling example, labourers in Rutland, so this is the poorest class, and this is in the south of England, it's a rural area at that point in time, live on average for 38 years. And then if we look at Liverpool in the northwest, a particularly urban area, newly industrialised in 1842, then the average life expectancy is only 15. Now that is of course highly influenced by very high child and infant mortality rates. If a Liverpool labourer made it to adulthood, then their life expectancy would actually be longer. But nonetheless, it shows that this has been a division that has existed for a long, long time. Now, of course, the causes will be different then from how they are now. So in the 1840s, this is the time of big infectious diseases, and Edwin Chadwick's report actually led to some big public health changes, the 1848 Public Health Act in England, which brought into things like sewerage, for example, and local tax rates for funding certain public health improvements. The north-south divide is very kind of prominent within political and media discussions in England today, but we can see that it was also the case then. So these are two famous books from the 19th century, North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell and Hard Times by Charles Dickens, which are contrasting the conditions of the industrial north with the south, and have particular public health relevance, particularly around industrial diseases. So it's something that's lasted a long time. We can look at it in more detail today using this, which is a train line diagram. This is looking at the 3 main train routes in England. And we can see as you go north that generally speaking, the health gets worse, and that this is particularly prominent here on the North Western Railway. What the map also shows, though, of course, is that there is some problematization around the socio-spatial gradient, and we can see that even within the north, there might be some areas that are doing better than others. But as public health people, we do tend to deal with averages, so on average, the north is doing worse than the south. So just to bring in my original sports thing, this is my English version of the hockey one. It's the Public Health League. I published this a couple of years ago, and it got quite a lot of attention in national newspapers, because I think if you have football or perhaps hockey linked to a public health message, people are more interested than if we just have the normal statistics. I won't go into huge detail, but the sort of what would be shocking results for us in a football sense is that Manchester and these 2 teams are in Liverpool are in the zone where they would get relegated to the next league. These are 3 of the top football teams in the world, yet in health terms, Liverpool and Manchester, the centre of Manchester, are the 2 poorest areas and the two areas with the highest mortality rates. So I think whilst the football thing can seem a bit frivolous, you can have important messages within the data. And the other aspect is that with the exception here of Manchester United, and that's because they're grounded in a more affluent part of the Manchester area, then almost all of these teams that are in the top of the table are all the southern teams, and those towards the bottom end, with the odd exception, are in the south. So you've probably got the idea that there's a north-south divide in England, but also you'll be well aware as Canadians that there's also divisions within your own country, within all countries, and that you of course have your east-west differences between Newfoundland and through to Vancouver and British Columbia. Okay, so the third example that I want to talk about is the neighbourhood inequalities. Thinking about how different suburbs, different neighbourhoods of the same place can have quite significant inequalities in health between them. So this is Newcastle. This is by some of my colleagues put this together. This is using our metro line, so like your subway, using our stops, and this is the healthy life expectancy. So how long someone living in these neighbourhoods would be expected to live without a disability. And we can see that there's a big difference between the airports at 75 through to the biker area of the inner city at around 64. This is the second example, which sometimes seen as the more famous example, but that's because obviously all our politicians are in London and don't really understand the north. But we can see here that there's a 7-year gap between Westminster, which is where Parliament is, and if we go along the Jubilee Underground line, 7 stops, you end up at 75 years. Now, you're not getting away free here, so here's the differences across Paris. It's a 5-year gap in average life expectancy between the Moulin Rouge and the Louvre neighbourhoods. And of course, you'll be familiar, particularly in this institute, on the inequalities within the island of Montreal, with an 11-year gap between the neighbourhoods here. So, obviously this is data that people are familiar with. I might have presented it in a more interesting way, but it's something that we've known for a long time. And it's about then how have we conventionally tried to explain it from a public health and sort of geographical perspective. And this is where there are 2 main schools of thought. One is looking at the composition of the people that live in those neighbourhoods, regions or countries. And the other is looking at the context, the actual aspects of the place itself. So if we're trying to explain inequalities in place from a compositional perspective, then you're arguing that it's to do with the people that live there. And so if you have a population that's older, has more men, for example, than women, or has different ethnic makeups, then you would expect some different health outcomes based on those demographics. More significantly, the argument is about health behaviours and also about socioeconomic status. So if you have more people living in a neighbourhood who are from a poorer background, less educated, or of lower occupational class, then you would expect the health of that neighbourhood to be worse. Equally, if people are more likely to be smoking or drinking and so on, then you expect the health of that neighbourhood to be worse. So this is the composition argument. It puts the focus on the population, on the people, rather than the neighbourhood itself. The contextual explanation instead focuses on what's going on in that neighbourhood, looking at things like the physical environment, the social environment, and the economic environment. So we can see, for example, certain neighbourhoods will have higher levels of pollution, might have higher levels of contaminated land, and they might have less access to green space, all things that we know are associated with worse or better health outcomes. From a social perspective, it's about the access to services that people might have in different neighbourhoods. So some neighbourhoods might have poorer housing stock, they might find it harder to access health services, for example, and it may also be that the environment is not conducive from, for example, the obesogenic environment argument, that you're not able to access the ingredients for a healthy life. Also, in terms of a kind of economic perspective, then you can think of if a neighbourhood has a lower job rate or a different type of work available, if it's only very difficult work or low paid work available in that neighbourhood, region and so on, then that's what people will end up being involved in. Or if the economy has high unemployment rates, then that will again have an area level effect on the people living there. So in one of our projects, we decided to try and test a little bit these two arguments around context and composition to see how much they were contributing. So this is the northeast of England. This is where I work in Newcastle, and down here is our study area of Stockton-on-Tees. Stockton-on-Tees, it has the unenviable position of being the local authority, so the municipality or county in England with the highest life expectancy gap between its neighbourhoods. And for men, the life expectancy gap between the most affluent and the least affluent is 17 years, and for women it's 12 years. And this has been going up over the past 5 years or so. So we wanted to explore why is this the case. And you can see these are the most deprived areas, and the shaded areas are the most affluent. So you can see that in many cases, they're very close to one another. 17 years difference in life expectancy, but less than 2 miles apart in terms of where they are in the town. So we've been doing a variety of different pieces of research, ethnographic, qualitative, historical, and also a household survey looking at different health outcomes. So this is the physical component score as the SF8, the European Quality of Life indicators. And what we're interested in is looking at the gap and then using the composition and contextual explanations to try and think what is causing the gap, in this case in morbidity, and therefore perhaps what do you need to target to do something about it. So if we think about it from a compositional perspective, then we can think, right, so socioeconomic status can influence health through psychosocial and material mechanisms, and also there's the issue of health behaviours in a neighbourhood. And we looked at how much each of these factors for each people within the population, the two groups, the most and the least affluent neighbourhoods, how much were these different factors contributing to it. So these are the compositional factors, and then we have the environmental factors as the contextual factors. And perhaps the highlight or the headline from this data is that it's the contextual factors have some influence, but the most important influence in terms of explaining the health gaps here are the psychosocial and the material. In contrast to the majority of public health interventions and activities in England, which target behavioural factors, these were contributing very little. From a scientific perspective, then this clustered is also interesting because you can see it's quite high. And this is where you have the interaction of the composition and the contextual variables. And that's something that has been written about before from an intellectual as well as a statistical perspective, that we can't really distinguish between compositional factors, i.e. the people that live in a place, and the contextual, the place itself, because obviously the two interact and they shape one another. So you end up in a position of having, is it poor people, is it poor places, or is it both? If we want to take the compositional contextual approach over to my other examples, then we have the idea of, is it the north as a place, so that would be the contextual argument, or is it northerners themselves? Is there something about the people that live in the north? So this would then be thinking, right, so do people in the north behave less healthily than people in the south on average? Or do they live in an environment that is less healthy? And as with my previous example on neighbourhood effects, the answer is, of course, a little bit of both. So you can find statistics to show that, for example, alcohol-related admissions to hospitals are higher in the north, particularly in the northeast region where I'm from. But equally, there is data that shows that things like brownfield, contaminated land, people living in less therapeutic landscapes, are also a higher proportion of that within the north. So again, we get to this idea that there's a little bit of both factors going on. In terms of trying to explain the US health disadvantage from this perspective, then I was involved in a report from the Institute of Medicine in the US, and this concluded around various factors, thinking about the behavioural, economic and educational differences between the US population and the people living in particularly Western Europe, but also in Canada, and then also the issue of the place itself. So from a compositional perspective, then we've seen the obesity data earlier in my talk, and you can also see in terms of average calories per day consumed are around 500 calories more per day consumed by the average American than the average Swedish person, for example. In terms of issues like socioeconomic status, then poverty rates are highest in the US and are coming in at over 22% versus around 10% in some of the better performing European countries. Equally, educational level of the US population, as recently demonstrated with voting patterns, is lower than in countries, particularly in Western Europe. From a more contextual perspective, then we can think about things like the physical environment of US cities in terms of the lack of walkability, the reliance on using the car for transportation. There's been a lot of research in the US around the idea of food deserts, where people in low-income neighbourhoods find it impossible to buy healthy food, particularly at an affordable price. And then there's also bigger issues from a psychosocial perspective around things like social capital, involvement and participation in society and so on. So this is how far the kind of conventional approaches to research takes us. And the work that I've been doing has been trying to think of these geographical health inequalities from a more political perspective, thinking about how we look upstream. So how I sort of describe it to my students is to think, do you have a clinical or an acute health issue that's coming forward that might be something like, let's say you've got hypertension, which might be caused by, let's say, for example, something like a poor diet at a compositional level, which might be influenced by a lack of healthy food availability within your neighbourhood, so the obesogenic contextual environment. But how are these come about? So why have we got local neighbourhoods that are having these issues? And this is where there's a role for the political, the macro, and thinking about the role of the market and the political economy. So I just want to apply this over to one particular example, which is the US health disadvantage, and thinking about politics as the rules of the game. So we can see here just some different pictures from the last year, some probably more attractive than others. And We have to think, actually, if politics the rules of the game for public health, it does matter how we vote. He and probably she are going to have, I think, a different public health policy from the Liberal Trudeau government that you have here. Certainly after hearing your Minister for Health, Philpott, speak at the World Health Summit earlier this week. I think it's a very different message from what we've been getting in Britain, for example. So if we have this at the political level, those decisions are going to filter down into what policies are implemented, and they are in turn going to impact on those neighbourhoods and on the health of our populations. So I don't think a political approach is particularly radical when we start thinking about it like that. But what does it mean if we then try and apply it across to explaining one of our case studies? Here is the case of the US. I explain more in my book about how you can take a political approach to the other inequalities that I've talked about. So we can think here through in terms of the fact that the US has various aspects at an institutional and political economy level that are different from other high-income countries. So this is the work of Wilkinson and Pickett from the Spirit level, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. And it shows, obviously, the very high income inequality in the US. And we know now this well-established relationship between health and social problems and income inequality. So we can begin to see here how one of these macro issues is impacting potentially on the US health disadvantage. A second issue is around things around political incorporation. So this is a chart looking at trade union density in different countries for different time periods. And we can see that whilst in most countries there has been a decrease over time, as you might expect with the decline in terms of manufacturing and so on, and also some of the anti-union legislation brought in countries like the UK. But what's perhaps most striking is that the US starts off extremely low and now has only around 11% of people who are involved in a trade union. And of course trade unions were fundamental in terms of balancing off the power of capital in terms of setting up some of our most important political institutions and our institutions of the welfare state. Other issues particular to the US was around the political incorporation, for example, of women was very late. And then also, most fundamentally, of course, the civil rights for African Americans doesn't come in until the late 60s. And there's been some important work done by Nancy Krieger from Harvard, which looks at the effects of the civil rights being granted to people, what effect that had on infant mortality gaps between black mothers and white mothers in the US. And you find that in a period of expansion and incorporation, the gap declines. But then when there are cuts to welfare in the 1980s under Reagan, then the inequalities by race increase again. So political incorporation can be important at a macro level. Now, of course, the US has a welfare system rather than a welfare state as we would know it in Europe, and that's why it has the higher levels of poverty. They don't come about accidentally, they're coming about through a lack of a social safety net. And of course, famously, they do not have, and are even further away as of last week, from universal health coverage. Finally, obviously, public health regulation is a very political thing as well. So this is the example of when they tried to put big taxes, I think it was in New York, on the sizes of sodas, these giant sodas that people were drinking. In the UK, we're introducing a sugar tax. Denmark tried to have a fat tax, then it was taken back. So these elements, tobacco control, for example, having a ban on tobacco, you know about these issues in Quebec. These are all part of political decisions and are determined by politics and the balance of power as to which way they go. So I think every aspect of public health ends up being political, even if it's nutrition or tobacco control that might be elements that we are traditionally more comfortable with. So, what does that mean? What do we need to do? If politics is important, how do we go about trying to get a healthy public policy? And I was talking earlier this week at the World Health Summit on a special panel chaired by Louise Pauvin, which was about the legacy of the Ottawa Charter on Health Promotion, which I'm sure you'll be familiar with. And I think we can learn again, we can re-familiarise ourselves with the issues that they have here. which are building from healthy public policy through to the communities and then through to the individuals and the health services. So actually the Ottawa Charter is taking quite a macro approach, and we're reflecting that now. In terms of the evidence for how do we reduce inequalities, how do we reduce these gaps, then whilst as a researcher I should be saying that we need more research, in reality I think we know a lot of the answers, and I believe you've had some of the people here like Margaret Whitehead and Sir Michael Marmot to talk to you about some of these issues. So these are all the reports looking at how do we make the US have better health, how do we close socioeconomic inequalities, how do we reduce the north-south divide in England, and of course the original Black Report from 1980, which fundamentally set out a lot of the issues and massively influenced the emergence of health inequalities research in the UK and also here in Canada. These all have recommendations. I did a piece of work looking at the Black Report, the Atchison report from 1990, and then the most recent Marmot report from 2010, which they all looked at what do we do about health inequalities in England, but I believe they've been taken up more widely. And we did this piece of research with Catherine Smith from Edinburgh, looking at what was different about each report and what did they have in common. And I would say about 75% of the recommendations are basically the same. The only real difference between the Black Report and the Marmot report is that the psychosocial theory of health emerges in that interim period, and there's more understanding of a gradient rather than just focusing on a gap. So there's intellectual changes, which of course have influences for the policy recommendations. But on the whole, we've known this stuff for ages. And I think you could even argue and say, actually, Virchow knew about this 200 years earlier. So I guess that's a way of us to think, what can we actually do? And I don't want to leave it in a sense of we haven't done enough, we need to engage more with politics. All of that is true. But I want us to also think about actually there is hope. There are examples of where such inequalities have been closed. And this is German lessons for England, not a popular thing to say in my country at the moment, but nonetheless there are, and some of you might have come across this. So we've got a big inequalities between, of course, communist East Germany up until 1990 compared to capitalist West Germany. And this is for men. We can see here that in the 1980s you're getting a big gap, 4-year gap. After reunification, there's a closing of the gap. So the life expectancy difference now for men between East and West is only 6 months. For women, the change has been even more astounding. The 4-year gap has been completely gone. We've got equality now across those two regions. Now, how did they do that so quickly within one generation? And I think there's probably 3 aspects to the answer. The first is in terms of rapidly improving the healthcare system within East Germany, which was, probably 30 years behind that of West Germany. The second argument and evidence from the literature is around living standards. So simple things like variety of diet and quality of diet, wages and so on, access to better services. And then the third, and arguably the most interesting, I think, is around the health particularly of older women, which comes from the pensions. So Cole famously said, a mark for a mark. And because East German women had very long careers because they were encouraged to be equal members of the labour force within the East, they had very strong pension entitlements, which meant that they were coming out with about 80% of the pension of a West German woman. So it meant that they had a good income in their retirement. So these are the kind of arguments. We can see that they're materialist arguments. You could probably argue that there's also a psychosocial element in terms of coming out of a communist regime, being reunified and so on. But why did it come about ultimately is because there was a political will to unify the country, to bring the two halves together and to uplift the East. So my argument for those of us looking at provincial divisions or regional divisions in England is that actually if you want to do something good, you can do it. And these health inequalities can be decreased. Oh, we've gone too far. So I'm going to end it there on that positive note. And I would obviously just like to thank the Leverhulme Trust, who have been generously funding my work for the past few years. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Claire, for this very thorough and pedagogical talk.
Thanks.
You've been step by step, and it's very clear. Des questions?
Thank you for this very clear talk. The England recently went from a health system governed public health to a municipal governed public health. Do you see this as levers for more actions either on the political front or the contextual front?
Thank you, that's a very interesting question. So, for those of you who don't know, in England, until 2013, the public health role, your role, was within the National Health Service at a regional level, but within the health system. And it's been transferred largely to our municipalities, so within a local government context. And that was a return to something that we had in the early 1970s. And intellectually, it makes sense because it means they can focus more on the social determinants rather than just on the kind of preventative medicine. And there are some examples of where that has worked. So, for example, in one of the counties near me, they immediately did a piece of work working with us about road traffic accidents amongst children. Could they put in some, speed limits and so on to decrease the death rate and the accident rate? And of course, that's very much about the built environment. So there are some good examples. However, the wider context is that England's been experienced or subject to austerity, so lots of cuts at the same time. So public health goes into a local authority at the same time as that local authority is downsizing massively with 40% budget cuts. The public health, 40%.
40%.
There's actually the risk that some of our municipalities will actually go bankrupt. They're having to spend all of their reserves. And we're just going to get more of the same, I think, come June, unfortunately. So it could have been a good thing, but the context within which it's happening is obviously one where councils, municipalities are having to look at what they have to provide from a statutory perspective, so what their complete legal obligation is. So for public health, it's actually quite small. It's sexual health services, a health check, and maybe one or two other things. So a lot of the kind of more social determinants work is probably not going to happen because there isn't any money. Well, they don't have any money. There's money in England, it's just not with the people.
For better outcomes, how do you see the right mix of national macro policies and community actions? How the two factors congregate to a better outcomes?
I've been doing some work with Jenny Popey, who you might also know because she works with Louise. She's from England. She does a lot around community health, and I know Louise does as well. And there is an important role for that. But I feel that at the moment, particularly in the UK context, communities are kind of being left to get on with it. They're being left to fill gaps where these public services have been pulled out. And it's like, oh, don't worry, a community group can do that. So, for example, a community group can run the library. That doesn't matter. And of course, then it becomes something that's no longer fundamental, no longer a state service. So I think we need to have a macro environment shaped by public policies for us at a national level, for you at a federal and a provincial level, that makes an environment in which actually those community groups can flourish and are supported. And I don't believe that we have that when too much pressure is being put on those community groups and the communities themselves. That's not to say they can't do things, but we all need to be in a position where the environment is also supporting us.
Thank you for your presentation. We've had governments that have tended to look at public policies, healthy public policies, as being politics involvement, and that people that would work on healthy public policies would would infringe and going too far on their domain. Have you encountered that? And do you have any options that you can propose to deal with that issue? And the right governments tend to be very confronted or completely against any policies that would come from public health in that sense.
Yeah, I think that's the situation that we would find ourselves now in within England as well, is that public health is being made about individual behaviour change, possibly a bit of health promotion, health education, possibly a role for community groups, but largely that very downstream, because then there's no responsibility for the government if there are increases in inequalities or decreases in particular health outcomes. For example, we've had increase in rates of mental poor health across the population, increased rates of suicide. But, you know, that's actually, the argument is, well, that's the fault of the individual. It's an individual matter. So it's devolving the responsibility, the risk, down to those individuals. So I think we're in a similar position. And of course, it's political. If I went back 10 years, 15 years, we had a different colour government, then the attitude was somewhat different. I'll stop there because this could be a long answer otherwise.
I'm in a racial council. I have a question in that respect. We know that in England, traditionally, the north part was mining and heavy industry and everything that is precursors to industrial disease and poor health. Now that the transformation of the economy of that area is progressing, from my own experience, I see a city like Leeds now are just a tourist hub rather than a production hub. Do you have some telltale numbers to evaluate if the general health of the population, of the younger crowds, is improving because they work in, service sector, or maybe they have more psychosocial problem, but on their life expectancy, yes. Can you see some factors?
So the northeast and northwest of England particularly were very heavy industry orientated, and then there was a lot of deindustrialisation through the 80s and the 90s. And so there's therefore been a shift in terms of occupational exposures. However, what you find now is that you have a very high numbers of people who are unemployed. And it won't be in the unemployment figures, because it will be people on things like disability, people who are on low parent benefits for being lone parents. So, for example, in the early 2000s, when arguably England was going through a bit of a kind of economic boom in a sense, the employment rate in the northeast, so people who were in a job, was 60%. Now, the kind of Keynesian approach is that you need 70 to 75% of the population, the working age population, to be in a job for you to have full employment. So even in a real boom period, we were at 60%. In London, it was over 80%. So there's a big gap still. And I think what's happening is there's almost a second epidemiological transition, in a sense, away from occupational diseases to the diseases of not having a job. And you can see this in other places like Scotland as well. And people like Jerry McCartney and Chi Collins have written a lot about this in regards to the Scottish health effect, is that actually you get these what are called diseases of despair, so suicide, drug taking, other risky behaviours that increased rapidly through the 1980s as the loss of big industries, the loss of the community and sense of community and solidarity that went alongside that. So I think the changes have perhaps been bittersweet in that sense.
Thank you for a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
My question is also occupational health related. I'd like you to perhaps expand a bit on the work-related determinants of the social inequalities and give some international examples of public policy that has successfully addressed these.
Okay, so I've written previously about work and health, and so obviously there's there is a role for different working conditions in explaining particularly socioeconomic status, so those inequalities from socioeconomic status, which could then build into some of these neighbourhood and spatial inequalities. So I think the two sort of main areas would be in terms of the physical working conditions, which I think links into the previous question, and the second one will be around psychosocial working conditions, demand, control, support in the work environment. And we can see that there is data from studies. I think one, for example, was conducted in Sweden, which shows that there are big inequalities in terms of these factors. The physical environment is worse for people who are in lower skilled jobs and so on, and that might include things like working hours. And then on the perhaps more fundamentally, given the shift by and large in the economy, the psychosocial factors are more important, and you get gaps in terms of the level of control that somebody has over their job, whether they get to control what tasks they do, what support they get from their colleagues and their managers, and the impact that we know from the Whitehall studies around the effects that can have on, particularly on things like cardiovascular disease, but also on things like obesity and so on. So yes, those occupational factors are important and are encompassed in a sense within the socioeconomic status. But yes, it's good to have the opportunity to talk about that as well.
I have one question. What can we learn from Germany? Can we disentangle the part of the income, the best wages compared to best services?
I think you could try a model to do that, but the impact is likely to be all of them and the combination of all of them, just as we saw with the kind of context and composition. So having effectively pensions, particularly for older women, which meant you have a lower poverty rate amongst older women, but those older women also have access to better health services than they had before, and they're also able to spend their money on a better diet. I mean, obviously, the East-West Germany is quite an extreme case, but I still think there are things that we can learn from it, particularly around those material factors, around the poverty rates amongst older people, for example, and how that can be impacting. There was some research recently in England which looked at declining life expectancies for people, particularly women over age 80. So there's been a decline over the past 5 years. And the article argued that this was to do with cuts with the local authorities, social services, and so on.
Sorry, second one. Does mental health difficulties correlate geographically? And second, would mental health issues be prioritized in national policies?
Okay, so the first part of the question was about whether there's a spatial patterning to mental health issues, and the answer is yes. It strongly follows the other gradients that I've described, particularly in terms of those neighbourhood effects and the regional north-south divide, for example. What we've also seen in England is increases, as I said, around suicide, for example, but these have been socially patterned as well. So suicide rates there's about, it's a tenfold difference between the poorest 10% of neighbourhoods and the richest 10% of neighbourhoods, and where we've seen increases over the last few years has been in those neighbourhoods that are the poorest and have been most affected by the cuts to local services and the cuts to our welfare benefits. In terms of the second part of your question around prioritisation, I think there needs to be more of a focus than there has been conventionally, certainly within England, for example, where it's probably 95% of the budget and 95% of the attention goes on, well, mainly the hospital sector and acute conditions. So yes, I think you need more of a balancing within that.
Sorry. Have you noticed that the environmental aspect will increase over the years in the future, because we're talking about the air, okay, causing all kind of disease, but now we might have here, for example, in Canada, water pollution with all those projects, if I may say so. So is that something that is looked at? Because here in Canada in general, we take for granted quality of water, but it might be in the recent future something that we have to look at it closely, if I may say so. So I was looking for your opinion.
Yeah, so in terms of, obviously, the environmental changes will probably become more important. If I take the air pollution, then that's suddenly become quite a big issue in England over the last few years. In a way, and a lot of people are now modelling it and looking at it, and in particularly in places like London, there was a study last year which showed that around 10,000 deaths within London could be directly or indirectly attributed to problems around air pollution, which is largely to do with diesel vehicles. So I think it's something that will become more of an issue. Whether our governments choose to act and constrain consumer choice and constrain industry is perhaps a different matter.
D'autres questions? Alors, je voudrais vous remercier encore beaucoup. Il y a aussi la possibilité, j'ai laissé la publicité pour ceux qui voudraient en savoir plus, de commander le livre de Claire, qui se lit comme un roman et mieux que ça. So, thank you again.
Thank you very much.